Welcome everybody to Pembroke College, of course the home to J.R.R. Tolkien, the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon from 1925 to 1945. And in 1931, on a presumably cold, dark evening, much like this one, here at Pembroke, Tolkien gave his seminal lecture on the art of language invention and the relation between myth and language to the Johnson Society. One of the most ingenious papers that the Society had ever heard, the minutes of the evening record. And fast forward 85 years, no more and no less, to November the 29th, 2016, and it is truly a delight to be able to welcome Tolkien scholars Dimitra, Fimi and Andrew Higgins to discuss their critical study of the essay which stemmed from Tolkien's lecture. And also reproduced in their work is a new old essay and drafts from Tolkien's manuscripts, which are accompanied by detailed editorial notes and introductory material. So this evening's talk will be followed by the opportunity to ask questions to Dimitra and Andy. And then we will have a complimentary drinks reception in the postgraduate middle common room, and we'll direct you that way in due course. There will also be an opportunity to see a collection of Tolkien memorabilia in the college library, and for which my sincerest thanks to our college librarian, Laura Cracknell, who unfortunately couldn't join us this evening, and also to Tolkien memorabilia collector, Andrew Ferguson, who's kindly brought a menu signed by those present at the Johnson Society dinner of that year, including Tolkien actually, and a first print of The Hobbit. And before I hand over to Dimitra and Andy, I'd just like to say a few words about their work in the realm of Tolkien scholarship. So Dimitra Fimi is a senior lecturer in English at Cardiff Metropolitan University. She is the author of Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, From Fairies to Hobbits, published by Pembroke College in 2008, which won the Mythopoeic Scholarship Award in Inkling Studies. She's also published articles and essays in journals, edited collections and reference works, including the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia, Routledge 2006, Tolkien, The Forest and the City, by Four Courts 2013, and a companion to J.R.R. Tolkien, Blackwell 2014. Along with Andrew, she has co-edited the book in question, J.R.R. Tolkien's A Secret Vice, by HarperCollins this year, the aforementioned critical edition of the essay of Tolkien's essay on invented languages. And her next monograph on Celtic myth in contemporary children's fantasy will appear from Pembroke next year. She lectures on Tolkien, fantasy literature, science fiction, children's literature, and medievalism at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Andrew Higgins is a Tolkien scholar who specialises in the role of language invention in Tolkien and other fiction. His PhD thesis, The Genesis of Tolkien Mythology, explored the interrelated nature of myth and language in Tolkien's earliest work on his legendarium. He has, of course, also co-edited this fabled book that we're celebrating this evening. And this spring, Andrew taught a 13-week online course for Signum University, the Mythgard Institute, called Language Invention Through Tolkien. He's currently working on turning his thesis into a book, and also planning another book surveying language invention in all of fiction, from Thomas More to Elvish to the Thraki. Andrew is also the director of development at Glyndebourne Opera in East Sussex. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dimitra and Andy, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hopefully the technology will work.
Yes.
Let's see. All right. No, it's a great pleasure for both me and Andrew to be here this evening, especially tonight on the 29th of November, exactly 85 years after Tolkien delivered his talk, A Secret Vice, to the Johnson Society right here at Pembroke College. Not quite this room, but in this venue. Now, as many of you will know, A Secret Vice was originally edited by Tolkien's son and literary executor Christopher Tolkien, and published in the collection of essays, The Monsters and the Critics, and other essays, among other canonical and lesser-known essays by J.R.R. Tolkien. However, both Andrew and I were quite aware that the folder in which the Secret Vice manuscripts are kept in the Bodleian, and manuscript Tolkien 24, contained a number of other notes and drafts, as well as a separate short essay on phonetic symbolism. At the same time, we both knew quite well and admired greatly the expanded critical edition of On Fairy Stories, which was again one of those essays that were originally in The Monsters and the Critics, which was prepared and published in 2008 by Douglas Anderson and Verlin Flieger. And in that volume, Doug and Verlin have presented the different versions of On Fairy Stories together with Tolkien's notes and drafts, accompanied with actually plenty of introductory and editorial material. And Doug and Anderson and Flieger, it's difficult to dissociate yourself from the fact that you know these people quite well. Anderson and Flieger justly, I think, named On Fairy Stories Tolkien's manifesto on the art of writing fantasy. A work in which he, as a quotation here, he declared his particular concept of what fantasy is and how it ought to work. But in On Fairy Stories, Tolkien also famously declared, mythology is language, and language is mythology. The mind and the tongue and the tale are coeval. So for us, A Secret Vice was very much, and its accompanying papers, of course, was very much a parallel manifesto for the art of language invention, which is an integral part of the kind of fantasy literature that Tolkien established. High fantasy which relies on world building, the creation of a complex and consistent secondary world. So invented languages are one of a variety of what Mark Wolf has recently called secondary world infrastructures. And Tolkien is one of the few fantasists who practiced the art of inventing languages to such an extent, to such a lot of detail, that there's so much work that went into them, and who actually theorized his own practice and created a strong legacy of language invention in subsequent world-building genres. So, in A Secret Vice, the earlier actually of the two papers, in comparison to On Fairy Stories, Tolkien actually foreshadows his famous declaration about language and myth-making as we know it from On Fairy Stories. He argues that the making of language and mythology are related functions, in fact, coeval and cogenital. So he's already working through some of the ideas that we see further on developed in On Fairy Stories in this essay. So we felt that an expanded edition of A Secret Vice in a volume that would include Tolkien's related papers and would hopefully reopen the debate on language invention and its role in modern fantasy literature was both necessary and timely. And we're of course very grateful to the Tolkien estate for trusting us and for granting us permission to publish a great amount of new, hitherto unpublished material by Tolkien, as well as HarperCollins for getting behind the project and seeing that both its scholarly importance but also its response to current debates and current genres and current texts. So the volume, therefore, you've got this sort of table of contents there. It begins with an introduction that actually outlines the history, the sources, and the method of Tolkien's language invention, and sort of argues for the centrality of Tolkien's invented languages within the context of his invented mythology, but also in response to artistic and linguistic developments at the time he was composing A Secret Vice. So we have sort of the immediate context and then the larger cultural context. We then present A Secret Vice itself, edited afresh from Tolkien's manuscripts, and our edition has actually restored to the text a few marginal notes and an entire section of a couple of pages that were omitted from the original edition. We'll come to that later on. We then present for the first time in print a brief essay by Tolkien on phonetic symbolism, a rather heretical, I suppose, idea that flies in the face of Saussurian linguistics, as it's predicated upon a direct relationship between the sound of a word and its meaning, the signifier and the signified. And Tolkien most definitely attempted to abide by some symbolic principles in his own language invention. So his ideas in this essay often anticipate much more recent, actually empirical studies and research. The third part of the volume presents Tolkien's notes and drafts for A Secret Vice and for the phonetic symbolism essay. And the material here was found in loose pages and slips of paper and was often written in telegraphic or unfinished sentences, often in handwriting that was yeah, quite hard.
Yeah.
Quite hard to read, you know, pencil that wasn't sharp enough, and all sorts of issues with sort of reading these papers. But there we are. But in there we found actually a mention of two surprising contemporary literary figures, James Joyce and Gertrude Stein. And we'll come back to that a bit later on. And then we conclude the volume with a coda on the reception and legacy of Tolkien's linguistic invention. You know, what comes after, where does all the theorizing and practice actually leads to. Now, I think I speak for both of us when I say that one of the highlights of the research that we undertook was the discovery of where and when exactly Tolkien delivered the talk. And actually, whether he ever did, you know, in the, if we think about the original edition in Monsters and the Critics, Christopher Tolkien noted that the manuscript of The Secret Vice appeared without date or indication of an occasion of delivery. But of course, it is written as a paper. You know, he's addressing clearly an audience in terms of the style that it's written in. But Christopher Tolkien dated the essay in 1931 based on its reference to the July 1930 Esperanto Congress in Oxford as taking place a year or more ago. So that's as close as we were at that point. Hammond and Scull, you know, in the very impressive chronology, which very much complements Carpenter's biography of Tolkien, also didn't seem to have any further information there. So, in a way, you know, for a while we're thinking, well, maybe that's something that we'll never find out. You know, we'll give it a go. But if nobody else has found it so far, you know, we might just have to admit that that's all we know. But after, you know, quite a lot of research in various actually Oxford clubs and societies, and, you know, good old-fashioned slow sleuth work, I think, and of course with the help of amazing librarians and archivists. You know, I don't think we can do anything without them, really. It was eventually uncovered that Tolkien delivered A Secret Vice for the Johnson Society here at Pembroke College at 9 p.m. on the 29th of November 1931. And it was a real joy and an unexpected boon, actually, to find out that a lengthy report from that evening survived in the Johnson Society minutes, now reproduced in the book and actually available to see today in the modest exhibition of Tolkien memorabilia in the library that we'll talk about at the beginning. And it was also great to discover a bit more about Tolkien's relationship with Pembroke College and particular people, and of course the Johnson Society. So, you know, to add even a small detail to Tolkien's biographical information was quite a big thing for us. I don't think we'll ever forget that moment of discovery. So here you can see the opening of the minutes of the 896th meeting of the Johnson Society. And there's the date and there's your time. Well, it isn't quite 9 p.m. and we aren't quite in the rooms of Mr. Bray. But this is as close as it gets, I think, to being in the same place at the same time where Tolkien delivered Secret Vice 85 years ago. And there's something very, very, very special about this, I think.
Indeed. And so Tolkien gave this talk at the Samuel Johnson Society of Pembroke College. And this society was named after probably the most famous alumni of Pembroke College, Samuel Johnson, the English writer, literary critic, biographer, editor, and perhaps most interesting for Tolkien, lexicographer. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography has called Johnson, quote, arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. And on the 31st of October, 1728, a few weeks after he turned 19 years of age, Samuel Johnson entered Pembroke College. His biographer, James Boswell, said of Johnson's time here, quote, no man had a more ardent love of literature or a higher respect for it than Johnson. His apartment in Pembroke College was that upon the second floor over the gate, which you can see in that picture right there. That's where his apartment was. However, Johnson's academic time here was cut rather short, only a year later when he was forced to leave due to lack of money, which I'm sure some students can identify with. Johnson never finished his studies here, but the university subsequently awarded him an honorary degree in 1775. He's probably most known for this work here, which is his Dictionary of the English Language published in 1755. It took Johnson 9 years to compile this work, although he claimed he could have done it in 3 years. This work has been hailed by Johnson biographer William Jackson Bate as, quote, one of the greatest scholarly achievements of single achievements of scholarship, and probably the greatest ever performed by one individual who labored under anything like the disadvantages in a comparable length of time. Just imagine having to compile all of the words that are in that dictionary. Johnson's dictionary was only to be surpassed by a project that was started in 1857 by the Philological Society, which eventually became known as the Oxford English Dictionary, which, as we all know, J.R.R. Tolkien himself worked at after World War I, where he was responsible for looking up words mainly having to do with the letter W. So, that's Johnson. What about the Johnson Society? Well, the Samuel Johnson Society was founded here at Pembroke College by college fellow A.T. Barton in 1871 in memory of Samuel Johnson. And the Society's remit, according to the archives, says, quote, the reading on a given subject accompanied by free discussion, and was originally an elected club. However, although it was a literary society, by the early 20th century, it had, quote, practically become a JCR meeting. And I think we all know what JCR here, a Junior Common Room meeting, which means basically the students ran the meeting. And that was described by G.B. Allen in the archives. The society was said to meet weekly during term time and also organize dinners in Oxford and London. For example, there was a dinner held at Samuel Johnson's house in Gough Street, Fleet Street, London, and it was graced, according to the minutes, by the presence of G.K. Chesterton. So they had lots of famous guests that would come to the dinner as well. So here are the records from 1927 to 1933 of the papers that were given at the Johnson Society during the time Tolkien gave his Secret Vice talk in 1931. And one of the most striking things about it is the wide variety of papers that were given on lots of different subjects. So you had papers given on, of course, Samuel Johnson, makes sense, and other early modern British writers such as Jonathan Swift, we'll talk about Swift in a minute, Thomas Browne and John Harrington, some of the late British poets, novelists, and playwrights like Matthew Arnold, Thomas Hardy, Rupert Brooke, Bernard Shaw, French and Russian novelists like Rabelais, Balzac, Gogol, and Dostoevsky, a range of American authors, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe, Sherwood Anderson, Eugene O'Neill, Sinclair Lewis, as well as contemporary modernists such as Catherine Mansfield and Gertrude Stein, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then other wider topics such as Arthurian legend, Chinese poetry, Japanese color prints. That might have interested Tolkien because he owned a series of Japanese prints when he was at Exeter College, Oxford. The Greek islands, and then highly contemporary topics such as The Jazz Singer, which had been released in 1928, caused a paper to be written about sound in cinema, and other papers on such intellectual figures as Christopher Morley, the travel writer Philip Guardella, Julian Huxley, and Lawrence of Arabia. So this was, they were engaging with lots and lots of topics here.
Just for a second. Okay, so this is Tolkien in the 1930s, early 1930s. So Tolkien's association with the Johnson Society goes beyond just this delivery of a secret vice. And again, the minutes were a great resource to find out more really there. Tolkien became a fellow of Pembroke College as part of his role as Rollinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon, to which he was appointed in 1925. And the society actually, the Johnson Society, attempted on more than one occasion to invite Tolkien as a guest to one of their former dinners in the 1920s. So in the minutes of the 19th of June 1927, it's recorded that Mrs. R.G. Collingwood and John Maskell were unable to attend the society dinner, and therefore, quote, it was decided that the following two gentlemen be invited, Mrs. Ralph Strauss and J.R.R. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. But there we are. In the event, actually, neither attended the dinner, which was held on the 23rd of June. But the following year, the minutes of 13th of May 1928 show that both Collingwood and Tolkien were suggested as guests for the dinner of the 20th of June, but the society voted in favour of Mr. Collingwood. Collingwood, by that time, actually had given two papers to the Society of Jane Austen, both of which were greeted with enthusiastic reports in the minutes. However, Collingwood was unable to attend, and Tolkien was duly invited instead. And according to the minutes, again I'm quoting, the society listened to various speeches which, with the exception of that of Professor Tolkien, were remarkable for their singular lack of wit. Professor Tolkien then entertained the society with a series of amusing stories. I don't know what these stories were, but there we are. Tolkien was also present. I'll just go back one. There we are. Tolkien was also present in the Johnson Society 60th anniversary dinner, in which he was the respondent for the toast to the college proposed by the secretary of the society. And you can sort of spot, let's see, we've got my laser thing here. Where is it?
Down a bit.
There.
Bottom corner.
There. Got it. Okay. So there's the signature in the menu card, and the menu is part of the private collection of Mr. Andrew Ferguson, who very kindly supplied the image and has led the menu for the exhibition today. So thanks for that. Now, two dons from Pembroke were either associated with Tolkien and the Johnson Society via the Society Minutes, or by directly being mentioned by Tolkien in a Secret Vice. And those two are R.G. Collingwood, as I just referenced a minute ago, and then R.B. McCallum. So we'll talk a little bit more about them and their relationship with Tolkien and the college.
Well, yeah, and indeed, if there was someone at Pembroke College during the time Tolkien was here that would have had a definite shared interest with Tolkien, it would have been R.G. Collingwood. He was born in 1889 in Cartmel Fell, Lancashire. His father was W.G. Collingwood, an acclaimed writer and archaeologist who, among other works, co-authored A Pilgrimage to the Saga Steads of Iceland from the Viking Society, which has actually just recently been reissued. You can get it online, which reported his travels in Iceland. Robin George Collingwood was a fellow of Pembroke College from 1912 to 1935, and he has a reputation as being one of the most original English philosophers, as well as being a lead authority on the history and archaeology of Roman Britain. But of real interest is his writings on folk and fairy tales from the 1930s, which were not published till after his death, when he would have known Tolkien. Collingwood's work here was published in 2005 as the book The Philosophy of Enchantment. And at the center of this book are 6 chapters of a study of folktale and magic composed by Collingwood in the mid-1930s and intended for the development into a book. He references this book will be in the text. Part 2 is Tales of Enchantment, explores fairy tales, enchantment, and magic. Now, one wonders what Tolkien and Collingwood might have spoken about here in the halls of Pembroke College. Indeed, Tom Shippey has actually wondered in print. I'm not going to do my Tom Shippey voice. Then there is Collingwood. No, I'm not going to. Then there is Collingwood. I'm astonished at the lack of a mention of Collingwood by Tolkien and vice versa. They must have had lunch together in the Pembroke College common room on many occasions. Both were thinking and writing about fairy tales at the same time. This is most surprising because Tolkien must also have known Collingwood's father, W.G. Collingwood. I do not think I would call W.G. a philologist, but he was a friend to philology, one of the founding members of the Viking Society in England, author of an important work on northern archaeology, or another book on his travels in Iceland. Robin Collingwood also combined archaeology, history, and fairy tale, as well as philosophy. Why were these men no closer together? So that's from an article Tom Shippey wrote in Tolkien and Philosophy, one of the Walking Tree books. So clearly, they had similar views and theories on fairy stories. For example, compare this quote from Collingwood. In calling a story a fairy tale, we are in effect ascribing to it 2 essential characteristics. As regards its form, we imply that it is a traditional story handed down by oral transmission from the past. As regard its content, we imply that it is not indeed necessarily about fairies, but about fairy, phase work, or enchantment, that its subject elements arising out of the idea of magic. Compare that with this quote from J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. The definition of a fairy story, what it is, or what it should be, does not then depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. I will not attempt to define that, nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. There are also some tantalizing references of Tolkien in Collingwood's work and vice versa. And our research in the archives at Pembroke College has revealed that they would have met, most definitely met, talked, and debated, at least within the context of the meetings and dinners of the Johnson Society.
So this is one of our two dons that I talked about a minute ago. The other one is Ronald Can McCallum. And this is actually what Tolkien says about him at the beginning of A Secret Vice, in a little marginal note in pencil, that again is one of those that were omitted from the original edition that we've now restored to the text. Some of you may have heard that there was recently, or a year or more ago, a congress in Oxford, an Esperanto congress, or you may not have heard. I heard, because I was invited to it by a certain Mr. McCallum, or McCallumo, to see a performance of L'Unclino di Charlie, which is the Victorian farce, Charlie's aunt, in Esperanto, so there you are. Yeah, well. All right, so McCallum was actually, of course, an Oxford Don and also a member of the Inklings. He was elected to a fellowship and tutorship in history at Pembroke College in 1925. So again, the same year that Tolkien also became associated with Pembroke. McCallum wrote actually a favourable review of The Hobbit and attended meetings of the Inklings from the 1940s. Actually, the man who's done most work on McCallum, David Brackman, is here with us today, and David has actually argued that McCallum may have been the inspiration for Alexander Cameron, a minor character in Tolkien's unfinished The Notion Club papers. Now, we found out McCallum was quite involved in the Oxford University Esperanto Club, for which he served as a senior treasurer. And he was a speaker, actually, there's the leaflet that we found, a speaker during its first public meeting on Tuesday, the 24th of February 1931, same year as A Secret Vice, on the topic, Need There Be a Language Problem? And this is from the Exeter College archives, actually. This is where the Esperanto Club was based. So Tolkien actually in the previous, sorry, let's see if I can bring it back, he's rendered his name, not Macaluma there, he's rendered his name in Esperanto. So Macalum, that O at the end is the standard masculine ending in Esperanto, perhaps nodding towards McCallum's support for Esperanto, but also to add a humorous tone. His audience, the members of the Pembroke College Johnson Society, certainly knew McCallum as a fellow of the college, but had also heard him presenting a paper to the Society on G.K. Chesterton on the 31st of May 1931, 6 months before Tolkien delivered A Secret Vice. Okay. How are we doing with time? Okay? Correct. All right. Okay, now, discovering the minutes of the Johnson Society was not just important for being able to ascertain where and when Tolkien gave the talk. The minutes were actually instrumental in our research more generally and influenced editorial decisions and may also explain some of the content of Tolkien's papers. So the first thing I wanted to sort of mention is the title of the essay, because the minutes confirmed that Tolkien gave the talk under the title A Secret Vice, which isn't the title in the manuscript. In the manuscript, the title is A Hobby for Home. So this actually confirmed Christopher Tolkien's choice of title, because that's how Tolkien had referenced, that talk much, much later. But clearly, when he gave the talk, that's the title he had already chosen at that point. So yeah, that was the first part.
And the second part was probably one of the most exciting elements of discovery for both of us, and that was in the midst of the main Secret Vice talk, we discovered, and we discovered this quite a while ago when we first discovered it. I was working on my PhD thesis at the time. A couple of pages rather hastily written by Tolkien in pencil, which outlined a hitherto unknown invented language called Funwegian. And our first reaction was pleasant surprise, and there is definitely a note by Tolkien himself to interpose this material into the main talk, which is written in ink, at a particular point. But Christopher Tolkien had not included these 2 pages, and it would be tricky to be sure that Tolkien ever read these pages when the talk was given. And we labored under that kind of nightmare feeling for quite some time until the minutes of the Johnson Society were discovered. And clearly, as you can see in this relevant part, the minutes say The most interesting example of the phonetic type of language is that spoken in the island of Fondway, which apparently has no connection whatever with any other known language, nor is it spoken or understood anywhere else than in this one small island. Intriguingly, this is the only invented language of Tolkien's talk that the minutes record. Remember, in his talk, he mentions Nathryn, he mentions Nedbosh, he mentions Quenya. None of that got picked up. What got picked up was Fonwegian. We hit the roof when we saw this. And this gave us the surety to restore these 2 pages in the edition of Secret Vice where Tolkien indicates. So Tolkien begins the Fonwegian part of the talk with these words. Quote, "Here I will interpose some material which will save this paper from being too autobiographical. I recently became possessed by accident of some secret documents, a grammar and glossary, and some sentences in the Fonwegian language spoken apparently in the island of Fonway. So, what do we get of Fonwegian on these 2 pages? Tolkien, kind of looking at where it comes in the talk and how it's structured and everything, it seems that Tolkien was using Fonwegian to show how one can create an invented language using elements of primary world languages, but at the same time achieving something completely original, with a specific focus on word form and sound sets. Remember what the minutes say about it being completely original. The manuscript pages give a tantalizing small sample of this language. And believe me, it was written in very hard-to-read handwriting. What we do get are some elements of a grammar whose structure suggests a learnt language like Latin with pronouns and a declension of what looks like an adjective in the 3 genders in the nominative and genitive cases, singular and plural. Tolkien makes the point about the originality of Fonwegian by first listing words that do show a derivative suggestion from a primary word language, mainly Latin. So you have a word like amosa, which clearly means love, and it comes from amo, amare, amatus in Latin, etc. But then goes on to list other words that are more original. Interestingly, we are not given any Fonwegian sentences that Tolkien claimed he found. So what's going on here? Well, towards the end of his talk on Fonwegian, he actually lets the cat out of the bag a bit, I think. He says in this course, in this part of the talk, Tolkien evokes the name of another past language inventor for fiction. Indeed, the granddaddy of them all, Jonathan Swift, who, by the way, was a colleague of Samuel Johnson. And Swift used elements of language invention in, of course, his most famous work, his 1720 work, Gulliver's Travels, to distinguish the different people the fictional traveler Gulliver met on his several shipwrecks on foreign islands. While the names, words, and phrases that Swift invented to distinguish these people do not have the coherence and consistency that Tolkien's own invented nomenclature would have, what it did show was how the sound sense of words could be used to establish different types of fictional peoples. Therefore, the introduction of Fonwegian served several purposes for Tolkien. It was used to illustrate his point about how invented words could be formed in unique but not alien ways. And it also seems to have been a ludic intertextual interlude on Swift's use of invented languages in his work.
There we go.
Well, that was quite something.
That was. For me, though, one of the biggest surprises while editing Secret Vice was found in the notes and drafts. Those little slips of paper with those handwritten notes that were really tough. And this is where Tolkien mentions, those 2 surprising contemporary literary figures I talked about before, James Joyce and Gertrude Stein. Joyce is not mentioned by name, but Tolkien has scribbled the name of one of his characters from what later became Finnegan's Wake, Anna Livia Plurabella. This is not the only time Tolkien is known to have noted this name. It also appears transcribed in his Quenya alphabet, also the Tengwa letters, in a document also dated 1931, now edited and published as a facsimile in Palmer, Endell and Baron 20, one of the specialist linguistic journals on Tolkien. But seeing the name of Gertrude Stein mentioned in the same collection of notes, at least to me, was initially a bit of a shock. Just thinking, am I reading, is this right? Have I got the handwriting right there? And yet, I suppose, after a lot of thought and a lot of sort of pondering this, it really shouldn't have been, because the first few decades of the 20th century were a fertile time for experimenting with language, both for utilitarian reasons and as an artistic expression. This was the time when amateur linguists, as well as a consortium of professionals, made numerous attempts to put together an international auxiliary language, like Esperanto, like Volapük, a number of them, which would facilitate communication between different people in a world that suddenly seemed incredibly small and in need of a tool that would bypass the distortions of grammar. So Joyce, like Tolkien, was particularly fascinated by that problem of Babel, and Finnegan's Wake contains a number of references and allusions to international auxiliary languages such as Esperanto, Volapük, Ido, idiom neutralium, not basic English, some of them are not that known anymore. He was interested in linguistic theories of the time, about the origins of language and sound symbolism, just like Tolkien. Indeed, Joyce's multilingualism and manipulation of everyday English in Finnegan's Wake was also described by a contemporary critic as an Esperanto of the subconscious. Now, Stein's poetry foregrounded the sound, rhythm and music of language rather than its meaning. And her notorious line, "A rose is a rose is a rose," plays with repetition and musicality on many different levels. There's a sense that this is a fragment of an ever-repeated sequence that never ends, but sort of loops into itself. But also, the continuous repetition of the same word ultimately divorces sense and meaning and imbues the word with a freshness and newness that it has lost. So instead of inventing new words, Stein aspired to restore everyday words to their original effectiveness and what she calls excitedness. Her reversal of the customary subordination of sound to meaning allowed for the composition of poetry based on the musicality of words, rather than any conventional use of words to mean something. Now, what Tolkien seems to have been taking issue with in his notes is the way Joyce and Stein play with the sound but ignore the meaning of language to a greater or lesser extent. And yet none of the two go as far as inventing a new language. They rather manipulate modern English to suit their purposes. So Tolkien definitely recognized the potential of sound, but he insists on a coherent meaning. And he goes on to mention his own invented languages as another solution to this artistic problem. And there's the quote: "We can pass to pure sound only by writing articulate sounds in measure, but sounds which have no meaning. The music is their voice, like a little tune on a whistle without accompaniment of voice or other instrument, some would say. It needs an ear and training to appreciate it. And even here, the best results are achieved because so taste coherence and character in the sounds and their combinations achieved by making a language in which the sounds do mean something, though only perhaps to the author." So I don't think we can blame the students of the Johnson Society by bringing up Joyce and Stein after listening to Tolkien delivering a secret voice. And here's again the actual extract from their minutes. After a discussion started by the president, in which the conversation drifted down such byways of language study as are formed by the eccentricities of James Joyce and Gertrude Stein, the meeting was declared informal, but continued until after midnight. Oh, I wish I was a fly on the wall. So the Johnson Society students most certainly saw some affinities between Tolkien's invented languages and the eccentricities of Joyce and Stein. It may well be, therefore, and I accept this as speculation on my part, that the hastily written notes that Tolkien has made on Joyce and Stein in loose pages in the same folder as a secret voice were written on the spot, possibly, during the talk or after the talk, or soon after while pondering that discussion that followed. It's also important to note that the Society had already heard a paper on Gertrude Stein in June 27 by Ralph Whittington Church, and that Stein had also been to Oxford for a lecture in 1926, an event organised by Edith Sitwell and promoted by Harold Acton. And as C.S. Lewis's diary notes, two of the Inklings attended this talk, Lord David Cecil and Neville Cockle. And Lord Cecil actually challenged Stein and received a witty response.
So, on this night, 85 years ago, in these very halls, Tolkien not only talked about the art of language invention, he also unveiled for the first time to an albeit small audience examples of his own language invention, ending his talk by giving examples of the Elvish language invention that he had been working on since the spring of 1915. Up to this time, Tolkien kept his language invention mostly to himself, hence a secret vice. When he did mention it to his family or friends, he would tend to minimize its significance, as when he told his then fiancée Edith Bratt in a letter from 1914, "I've done some more work on my nonsense fairy language." But after this night, many more people knew about Tolkien's language's invention, and it was perhaps his positive reception, and we think about the discussion that might have gone on to midnight, that encouraged Tolkien and helped Tolkien to continue the development of the Elvish languages, which by this time had become interlinked with his mythology. Indeed, following this talk, Tolkien would set out to expand both the narrative of his Elvish mythology in such works as the Quenta Silmarillion, and he would create a tree of tongues for his Elvish languages, which would expand the Elvish languages from the 2 he gave samples of in his talk, Quenya and Noldorin, to the 12 that would appear in various stages of development in the etymologies of 1938, the linguistic foundation for the languages that would appear in The Lord of the Rings. Another key legacy of this talk Tolkien gave here tonight, 85 years ago, was that it laid the foundation for the role of language invention in the world building of both the latter half of the 20th century and to this very day. Tolkien's, quote, "art for which life is not long enough," has gone on to influence and shape the art languages of today's world builders for fiction across all media, texts, films, TV, computer games. From the original Tach Bach Tach Be of Hamlet in the original Klingon, to the Hash Yer Dothrachet of David G. Peterson's Dothraki for HBO's Game of Thrones, and the many thousands of practitioners of today's not-so-secret vice, including yours truly, a legacy that I think probably would have both astounded Tolkien and may well have pleased him.
Well, there we are. So we're nearly there. Just to say once more how delighted we are to be here today. I've got one last slide just really. I mean, this is my sort of very amateurish drawing of the folder.
Oh, I remember this. Yes.
When we were trying to get our head around all the papers and, what order they should appear. So as you see in the folder, the pink there is the essay on phonetic symbolism. Then in yellow you have the essay as it was printed by Christopher Tolkien, and all the green bits are the extra bits that we also added. So, we often get this question, how much new stuff is there in the book? I'm a colour coding person, what can I say? I see things visually. So that's about it, really. But just to say once more, thank you ever so much for having us here. It's lovely to be here tonight, and we'd be more than happy to have your questions and do our best to answer them.
And also, it's out there now. We want everyone to engage with it, discuss, debate, etc. We look forward to lots of papers on the secret vice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.